No, I did not leave the church. I just went on my home visit to visit my mom. That's why I've been gone for 2 weeks. One of my good friends is a Jesuit named Jim, who used to live and work in New York. He was a writer for America Magazine. He still is. He's a West Coast correspondent. Jim told me about some friends of his who were visiting New York City recently to attend some sort of convention. The family was from a small town in Minnesota, and well, New York was the big bad city. The father, Jim's friend, and his 2 young kids were there for the first time. Dad had heard many stories about New York, none of which were reassuring to somebody from his small town. For example, he heard that the subway was to be avoided at all costs. If you take your children down there, that's the end of them. You'll never see them again. Watch out for the cab drivers. They're going to rip you off. People are rude beyond belief and they can't be bothered. And so it was with much skepticism that they ventured out into the city. What they found, my friend Jim was very happy to tell me, was, what they found was magic. The kids loved the subway. They were enthralled. And the tall buildings were a source of constant wonder. People were helpful, though not necessarily friendly. They weren't rude either. He found out that his stereotype of New York, which may have been true 30 years ago, it was far from his own experience. He started to look at the city with new eyes, and he reveled in the fact that his sons were thoroughly enjoying themselves. And he himself found signs of wonder everywhere, from the diversity of the population to the ease with which they were getting around. Somehow, the familiar, that which they had seen on TV and in countless movies, the familiar was new. It was begging to be explored and discovered. It was the same experience I had these past couple of weeks. As I said, I was in Manila in the Philippines for my home visit to go see my mom. She had moved out of her house after my dad died in September and had moved in with my sister and her family. And they live in a different part of town from where my parents lived, from where I grew up. And somehow, after 30 years of home visits and going to the familiar places near where I grew up, going through all this routine, somehow being in a different place, being in my sister's house, made this a very different trip for me. The setting was different physically, but also because my dad wasn't there. And so this city that I knew and know so well, this city that was very familiar to me, had somehow changed. And the familiar had become new. A few weeks ago, we heard about 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, 2 men who knew Jesus well. They had followed him sometime during his ministry. They may have even been around for a healing or 2. I'm sure they had heard him preach. And in so many ways, this Jesus was very familiar to them. They knew what had happened 3 days prior in Jerusalem when he had been put to death. And suddenly here he was, walking with them on the way. They thought he was a stranger. They asked him to join them. And then we are told that while he was with them at table, he took bread, he said the blessing, he broke it, he gave it to them, and with that their eyes were open and they recognized him. But he vanished from their sight. What happened? In their encounter with a stranger on the way, something changed. Something about their encounter with the risen Lord, who at first they did not recognize, altered them. And suddenly, in the familiar, they found something new. Now, I am not suggesting that the experience of the risen Jesus is like one's first visit to New York, or even one's recent visit to Manila. That's not what I'm saying. I'm suggesting that we all have had experiences that have changed us. Experiences that have allowed us to look at our lives with new eyes, so to speak. We've all had experiences that have opened our eyes to the reality around us in different ways. The early church had such an experience of the risen Jesus, and it transformed it. From a group of followers of an itinerant preacher, the disciples became missionaries who spread the good news that Jesus had risen indeed. But for that to happen, they had to have an experience of the risen Lord, something to transform them. They had to find something that totally changed their lives such that they were willing to give it up. And give it up they did. They must have had such a powerful experience of the risen Jesus that things could no longer be the same after that, because everything changed. It gives us a new perspective on things, new life, if you will. New life that produces new hope. But that only comes with the interconnectedness we have with the source of that life, of that hope. From our connection with the risen Jesus, like branches connected to the vine. It's a favorite image in John's Gospel, the vine and the branches. You don't really know where one ends and the other begins. Just like the intimate union between us and God, it starts with God's initiative. It is sealed by Christ's death, and it is expressed in the love of God and neighbor. At least that's what our second reading tells us. Simply put, to be a Christian is to live united with God in Christ, expressed in love for God and others. It's an important interdependence between us and God, because we will never realize what it is to be fully human if we are apart from God. And that same loving God is always looking to be in relationship with us. This back and forth bonding, this interconnectedness, these branches that are coupled with a vine, this is the special relationship between us and God. And this is not just a privilege of saints or mystics alone, no, because for John, it is the core of Christian life. We celebrate that whenever we gather in His name to break bread and to share it. For every time we pillow Christ on our tongue and cradle Him in our flesh, we find in that which is familiar, bread and wine, something new and life-giving. We remain in Him and He in us.